Chapter 10 of Ester Ried's Namesake. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ester Ried's Namesake by Pansy. Chapter 10. Words. After it was all over, Ester felt ashamed to think how much she had made of the one discordant note in her holiday. But the incident had tried her as no one but herself could understand, for no one else knew how sore she had become over those scruples. In reply to her appeal for help her father had written her a long, full letter, but he had not helped her. Indeed, it seemed to her that he had written about other matters altogether. Personal religion, a life hid with Christ in God, might be said to have been his text. It was not different in any way from what she had heard before, but for reasons that she did not fully comprehend it did not appeal to her as her father's ideas used to do. In truth, it almost repelled her. She muttered to herself that she had not asked father for a sermon, but to give her some common sense arguments, if there were any, with regard to a very different matter. Almost her father had ignored her call. At least, it seemed so to her. Yet near the close of his letter had come this: "With regard to scruples, daughter, and indeed with regard to all those arguments of which thoughtful Christians are inclined to speak with an interrogation point, I have not much to say at this time. If at some later date you would like to study the entire subject with a view of being helpful to younger persons, I shall be glad to give you in detail my opinions and my reasons for them. There are books also that might be read with profit. Bishop Vincent's 'Better Not,' for instance, was helpful to me when I was a young man. Professor Wilkinson's 'Dance of Modern Society' is one of the plainest essays we have on that subject, too plain, some people think, but unanswerable as to its statement of facts and its logical deductions, as is, also, Dr. Herrick Johnson's 'Plain Talks About the Theatre.' You did not mention that form of the question, by the way, but in your battle with scruples it is sure to come to the front sooner or later. These are all old books, but the dance and the drama and all the others have not in the meantime changed their character, and as principles never change, they will be helpful. If you were a young man I should suggest Robert Speer's book, 'A Young Man's Questions,' and some of the questions young women would do well to study, if not on their own account, for the sake of their brothers. Whenever you decide that you have time and inclination for a careful study of such subjects, I will be glad to send you these, and a few other books or booklets, together with my own opinions. But first, my beloved Ester Ried Randall, I covet for you another kind of study; another view of life altogether from that included in the may I, must I, or even the shall I mode of living. Believe me, daughter, there is higher, happier ground than this; an atmosphere in which all these and numberless other questions settle themselves and drop into their legitimate places, instead of forever thrusting themselves into a busy life to be thought out again. I hope you will, at some time, give them intelligent, exhaustive study, for the sake of being able to give such reasons for your convictions as will to some extent satisfy, or at least enlighten, such acquaintances as live all the while in that lower plane. I use the words 'to some extent' advisedly, for you must not hope to be fully satisfactory to any such. The atmosphere which they of necessity breathe on that lower plane does and must make a difference with their mental vision. But there is work for you, my daughter, which should come before this study for others. Your father craves for you, and daily, I might almost say hourly, prays that you may have such steady, conscious fellowship with your Lord that your life will unconsciously breathe out the same aroma that enveloped him." And then had followed such a tender and yet close personal application of what she called the sermon, that it started the tears and made her heart ache dully over what she felt must be her father's disappointment in her. It was always the thought of her father's disappointment that hurt; and yet she was half annoyed even while she pitied him. What did he mean by conscious fellowship? What did anybody mean by such talk? She did not understand it. What could it be but a sentimental instead of a practical way of talking about religion? Yet her father was the most practical man she knew. Ester had not been improving under the influence of those 5 chapters which she had compelled herself to read on that Sunday evening of stern resolve, nor had she been helped in any way by rigid adherence to the forms of a religious life, to which she had ever since held herself. She could not remember that she had ever before done so much systematic Bible reading as during the 6 weeks which had intervened, and she nightly knelt longer in prayer than for many months had been her custom. At least, she assumed the attitude of prayer, but she was learning what many another has had to learn by bitter experience, that to kneel and repeat forms of prayer is not to pray. In vain did the poor disciple struggle with the thought that she was in the presence of God, and try to hold her thoughts to communion with Him. Her prayers seemed to her to be all words. After one of her disappointing experiences she wrote a letter to her father, which it was a pity that she never sent. It described her effort to satisfy his ambition for her, and her vain struggle to realize something of what it meant to commune with God. "I have stumbled on a Bible verse," she said, "that just describes me. When I was a little girl mother taught me to pray aloud, and I still continue the habit. The other night, after I had been vainly trying to get any help in this way, I opened my Bible at random, and this sentence stared at me: 'A fool's voice is known by multitude of words.' I think if they paid any attention to me in heaven, which is not in the least probable, they must have said, 'There is that fool again on her knees pouring out words, words, words!'" But that letter she was ashamed to send. She felt that it would not only disappoint, but seem positively irreverent to her father and mother; so she tore it into bits, and they thus lost another opportunity for learning what her trouble really was. In this way she had struggled on; sometimes angry with all forms of religious life, and on the verge of casting them aside and stepping out boldly beside Faith Farnham the faithless; but more often bitterly angry with and ashamed of herself because she was not and could not be the kind of Christian that her parents would have her. Dinner on the mountain being finally over and the débris disposed of, the company broke into little groups arranged in accordance with their several tastes or fancies. Some of them wanted to loll about on the grass or make couches of the flat stones and rest, declaring that to sit and breathe the delicious air was all the diversion they needed. A few had brought their treasured books and sought quiet nooks where they could enjoy undisturbed a favorite holiday author. Those who could find no enjoyment in sitting still even to read, on such a glorious day, strolled off in choice companies among the rocks and ravines, bent on exploring. Among these latter was the trio, with their arms twined about one another. "I want to find a fern root like that one Elsie had in her window seat for so long," explained Faith Farnham. "She found it up here, and it was the most delicate little creature. Don't you remember it, Blanche? It throve nicely until Elise tipped it over and broke its neck, or its heart. I wonder if they have hearts?" There were rapid steps approaching from behind, and Professor Langham's voice answered the remark as though it had been addressed to him. "I am not sure as to that, Miss Farnham, but I am acquainted with every fern that grows in this part of the world. If you are in search of a special one, you would do well to invite me to join you, for some of them grow in what might seem to be inaccessible places." This broad hint was laughingly and cordially responded to, and the four walked along together, chatting gaily, until, as the road narrowed, Faith surreptitiously seized Blanche by the hand, and they quietly dropped behind. "Do let us give him a little chance," she murmured. "I'm awfully sorry for the poor man. I know he has been just longing for a little talk with Ester this great while, and one of us is forever in the way. Now that it happens to be two of us, I believe I can manage it." "Why," said the startled Blanche, "do you really think he wants to see her especially? I never dreamed of such a thing." "Of course you didn't, you dear blind bat, and I like you so much better for your blindness. If you were always seeing such things long before they happened, or ever meant to happen, as some of the girls are, I know I should hate you; but I really can't help seeing, sometimes, what is right before my eyes. I am as sure as I want to be that Professor Langham is only waiting for vacation, or opportunities. Ester can't keep vacation from coming, but she is a success at blocking opportunities. I honestly cannot make up my mind whether she, too, is as blind as a bat, or whether she really wants to spoil his chances. She has certainly spoiled them a number of times to my knowledge." The two thus left to themselves kept getting, unconsciously, at least on Ester's part, farther and farther from their companions. for they were walking at a brisk pace, while the two girls dropped into the slowest of saunters, and finally, unnoticed by the others, deliberately sat down on the trunk of a fallen tree to rest. "There," said Faith, as she watched the brisk walkers until a bend in the road hid them from view, "we have really done it at last. I wonder what will happen?" "Probably nothing," said the unimaginative Blanche. Doubtless Faith Farnham would have been disappointed could she have overheard the conversation between the two for whose pleasure she believed she had contrived. Esther, when she realized her opportunity, was not sorry for the one chance to speak a grateful word to the one man who had seemed to come to her aid that morning. It was true that she did not believe he knew he was speaking for her, but that did not alter her sense of gratitude. She had her lips parted to say, "I feel as though a descendant of New England ought to thank you for the toast you gave us," when he forestalled her. "Are you aware that your friends have further designs on your time, Miss Randall?" "Have they?" she said gayly. "I didn't know it." And the feeling came to her that any designs in the making of which Professor Langham had a share must be delightful. "They are not alarming," he said, with a pretense of assurance. "We are making up a little party for a Monday afternoon trip to town. We find that we can take the 2:00 train without cutting anything that is important, and have time for the little shopping which I believe all ladies are compelled to do whenever they reach the city before the hour for the matinee. A new time table is to go into effect to morrow, which gives us a 5:30 train, so we can reach home just in time for dinner. Your friends, Miss Farnham and Miss Halsted, have promised to be of the company, I believe, and Mr. and Mrs. Gifford are going, likewise the Barnards. May I hope that you will accept my invitation to be of the company?" Poor Esther! She wanted to go to the city. There really was a little shopping that had been waiting for such an opportunity. Esther's trips to town, though it was barely 20 miles distant, were very rare, and to go in such company would be a holiday in itself. But those scruples! Her face burned at thought of them. She felt indignant, but at what or whom? Only a few days before, while waiting in a bookstore for Blanche, she had picked up a little volume and been immediately interested in it because it was one of the books her father had mentioned, A Young Man's Questions. She had glanced curiously through it to see what a young man's questions were supposed to be, and whether any of them were like a young woman's. She had lingered over a sentence that caught her eye. "So long as the stage is as unclean as it is, and acting involves, as it constantly does, the stimulation of the basest passions and emotions, and this, even in good plays, it is almost impossible to support it at all, without in a real sense lending support to it all." She had copied the sentence as containing a good reply to something that Faith Farnham had said, and when she quoted it, had added, "There, you see what an up-to-date young man thinks of your pet amusement. You cannot call Robert Speer an old fogey or a fossil, as you know you are fond of doing when people don't agree with you. He is in every respect modern and cultured, as well as being thoroughly well informed." Then Faith had vexed her by calling him a religionist of the Puritanic sort. The quotation from the book came sharply back to Esther while her companion waited for his answer. It came and stood between her and the delightful afternoon that had been planned for her pleasure. She felt that she hated Mr. Speer. This, of course, was illogical, but must a girl's ill temper always run in logical lines? The professor was waiting. Her answer came by installments, confusedly. "Oh, thank you. It was ever so kind to include me. I am very sorry that I cannot go. It would be a delightful trip, I am sure." "I am going to take a teacher's privilege, Miss Randall, and give advice. If you are refusing on the score of lack of time, I feel quite sure that your mind will work all the better for a little rest and recreation. I have been observing you as a student, from the teacher's standpoint, with no little anxiety of late. You know it is part of a teacher's duties to have due regard to the health of his pupils. It has seemed to me that you have been overtaxing yourself, somewhat, and I sincerely believe that even the little trip which we have arranged will be a means of grace to you if you will let it." There was to be no escape for Esther. Those hated scruples must be owned to once more. "It is not a question of time," she said nervously. "It is simply that I may as well tell you plainly that I do not attend the theatre." "Oh, is that all? As a rule, I think I may be said not to do so myself. People who have work worth doing have not much time, of course, for such recreations. But isn't it drawing the line rather closely, being in fact what might be called puritanical, not to go at all?" There was an amused smile on his face, and a note of amused toleration in his voice. Still, Ester might have answered him quietly, but for that word puritanical. Over that she flamed. "Then you did not mean what you said, this morning, about the Puritan conscience and the debt we owed it? I am sorry, for I was really foolish enough to think that you did." "I meant every word I said; but, if you will pardon the correction, I said nothing about the Puritan conscience. It was the New England conscience of which I was speaking." "That is a distinction without a difference," said Ester haughtily. CHAPTER 11.